I'm indifferent.
I don't believe in God.
To the existence of
God is not judging them.
I don't have proof.
I don't know how to pray.
They're judging themselves.
Where is God in all of this? This is my home.
God exists.
What does it say about God that he created the orgasm?
I don't pledge allegiance to anything.
I don't pray.
Only to God.
If there was a God,
And I thought,
I just have this understanding that life is hard.
he could never love me after this.
God is still good.
Well, hey everyone, welcome to the Maybe God podcast. I am your host, Eric Huffman, and if you're new here, we would love it if you would please make sure and follow Maybe God wherever you listen to your podcasts. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube right now, be sure to subscribe to our channel, ring the notification bell so that you don't miss any of our upcoming weekly content that we hope is always aimed at helping hopeful skeptics and doubtful believers have deeper conversations by asking better questions. Now, all month long at Maybe God, we're digging into all things marriage, dating, and relationships. And today we've got some very special guests. They're authors, speakers, and they're the hosts of one of our favorite podcasts, which is called the Naked Marriage Podcast. Great name, great title. Dave and Ashley Willis have become two of America's most trusting experts on all things marriage and sex. So, Dave and Ashley, welcome to the Maybe God podcast.
Thank you.
Hey, Eric, thanks for having us, man. We're honored to be here. We love what you're doing.
Yes.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all so much. We love what y'all are doing, and I can't wait to get more into the weeds with you today and hear a little bit more of your story. So why don't we start there and just talk to us about who you are and sort of a little bit of background from where you grew up and how you met.
Yeah, we love our story. So we get like giddy telling people about it. But we actually are originally from Kentucky. I'm sure you can tell from our accents.
Never would have guessed.
But I was born and raised in central Kentucky. I'm the only one in my entire family for generations to move away because we live in Georgia and have lived in Georgia for about 15 plus years now. But we met at a little Christian school called Georgetown College and met my first day of class. Dave's 2 years ahead of me. And didn't date right away, but then got to know each other and dated that second semester. And we got married the week after Dave graduated. And so I still had a year and a half left of school. And we lived in a little rundown house on campus while Dave worked at a campus job, and then eventually was in ministry. And we did youth ministry the beginning, like first 3 years of our marriage. And then we had children. We have 4 boys ranging in age from 8 to 18. And we now, work for EXO Marriage and love it. And Dave is also a pastor at Stevens Creek Church here in Augusta, Georgia. And that is a really short, condensed version.
Yeah.
But
Well, I'll add a little bit, and that's that. Like we did a lot stupidly wrong early
goodness,
on.
yes.
I mean, you got married young. I made a bunch of mistakes.
which we loved getting married.
We loved
young.
it. Oh my gosh, I wouldn't
Yes.
change a thing about it. But just first off, in God's sense of humor, Ashley, who's always been brilliant, she was valedictorian at her high school, but she also won the superlative most gullible.
Most gullible,
and
yes.
so her friends can't believe that most gullible award winner is now a sex expert. And it's
Well,
just
it's
like,
very just. I know my friends who grew up with me are like, this is what you talk about. Like this just doesn't make sense.
God has a
love
sense
it.
of humor, and it's always uncharted, unexpected twists and turns he takes us on.
Yeah.
But early on, we had, money troubles. I had a real issue with pornography that, went back into my teenage years and then bled over into the early part of our marriage that caused a lot of brokenness and just, sexual confusion and a lot of issues that we talk about that issue a lot because it's so prevalent still today, more so than ever. We had in-law struggles. We had mental health struggles. We saw some really bad examples in marriage, even from people who were mentors to us. The lead pastor at our church and our female worship leader had an affair at the church where we were first serving. And
that was your first official ministry job.
Yeah,
So that was
so
pretty catastrophic in our life and the lives of many as people know who've been through that.
Yeah, so it was. We were trying to do stuff right, but we were stepping on a lot of landmines and seeing a lot of brokenness. But I think through that, I feel like God doesn't waste anything. I feel like He used all of that brokenness in the early years to really kind of plant seeds in us to say, like, hey, guys, I want to not only bring healing to you, but I want you to be a part of bringing encouragement to others out there in this world where it's hard to find healthy examples of marriage. And so we love what we get to do. And we say all the time, we're not experts. I don't know if a marriage expert exists, but if they do, they've probably been married for 70 years. We've been married for 22 and loving life. I love being married to my best friend, but we don't try to approach what we do as these experts, like, listen to us, we have the answer. It's more like we try to be encouragers. It's like, we're on the journey with you.
Yeah.
let's learn together, let's grow together.
Yeah.
And we love what we get to do.
We do.
Well, you're good at it, and you're a blessing to many couples. At what point did you decide maybe it's time to turn a corner from our struggles and actually start helping other people through theirs?
Gosh, I mean, I don't know, like if there was just one moment, but I do know kind of the first inkling that we might be doing marriage ministry one day was actually when we were in youth ministry, right, sweetie? We were talking to the kids, and at that time, the way that our church kind of structured things, we were helping the middle schoolers in particular. I actually taught middle school for a time in my life and loved that middle school age, which I think is like the most awkward age ever.
Yes.
And I hated middle school, and so I think like God wanted, I wanted to, like God used me to encourage others because it's just a hard time, but it's also an extremely important, informative time. And we were doing a relationship series, and we broke up into our small groups. And the kids were all, we were actually at a church that was in a part of our community where there was a lot of broken homes, a lot of parents just trying to make it day to day, just a lot of relational trauma going on. And so we talked about relationships a lot. And I remember in this small group, somebody, I can't remember what the question was, but it was something to the effect of like, what kind of relationship do you want one day? What do you think it will look like? And this little girl raised her hand, a little middle schooler, and she said, I want the kind of marriage that Dave and Ashley have. And we, at that point, we never looked at ourselves as any kind of example, because when you're in your early 20s getting married, you're dealing with all this stuff, feeling like you're blowing it the whole time.
Yeah.
We just had not even thought that these kids are watching us, not only as individuals, but as a married couple. And I think in that moment, we kind of straightened up a little bit, like, man, we gotta get this right, because it's not only for our sake and our family's sake, but for these kids that are watching us, and that we can help people. Not only these children hopefully have, healthier relationships than maybe they saw growing up, one day, but also, we're all in this together. Like, we all need help. And, I think that was the first time for me. What about you, sweetie?
Well, and I think that those kind of some of those early moments of people asking us for help and for advice,
Yes.
It sort of freed us from the trap of feeling like we had to have it all figured out before we could start helping.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we stay stuck in seasons of life where we think, no, I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready. I'm not experienced enough. I'm too this, I'm too that. But right where we are, we have something to give. We always still have something to learn, but we have something to give. And so we just said, all right, well, let's just start trying to help whenever God brings someone in our path that might need help. And let's keep learning and growing, and really, like Ashley said, stay on our toes as well, so that we're growing in our own marriage and trying to stay as healthy as we can, and connecting to people who are older and wiser. And that was really key for us, and still is to this day.
Yes.
Finding mentors, finding some people who are 10 years ahead of you that, again, aren't perfect, but they're healthy. They're doing it right for the most part, and just learn from them, hang out with them. Our culture tends to force us into these little pockets where we're only hanging out with people in our exact season of life, from preschool to old age. It's like we're in these little bubbles. But there's so much growth that happens when we're around people who are younger than us, older than us, and those who are right in the same season as well. And so I think that's one of the wisest things we did. We did a lot that was wrong in the early years. The one wise things we did, just like those little kids did to us, looking up to us, we found people who were 10, 20 years ahead of us and just intentionally hung out with them.
Yeah.
And
Right.
said, teach us. And even if it wasn't that specific of saying teach us, we were learning by just watching how they interacted, and that helped us a lot.
Sure.
And I want to say, like, we refer to it as like the mentor sandwich, where you can have, those people you are in the same season with, where you're edifying each other, as iron sharpens iron, but also that you have people 10 or 20 years ahead of you who are pouring into you and you're learning from, and then people maybe 10 years younger than you, or less or more, that you are pouring into. And I feel like that's just biblical, and that we're being, the body of Christ, a multi-generational ministry to each other, and to the world, because I think it's beautiful when we continue to learn. The couples at our conferences, like, I'm always so impressed by the couples who have been married like 50, 60 years, who sit on the front row at an EXO marriage conference or church conferences where we speak, because they're still learning. They're willing to come and learn from a couple who's been married 22 years.
Yeah.
Because they see themselves as lifelong learners. And I'm like, I want to be just like them. I mean, we're always learning.
Yeah, that's so good. And that might be exactly the answer to my next question, which is, you've talked to so many couples over the years. You've helped couples. You've been helped by couples over the years. What do you see as sort of overarching themes in the strongest and healthiest marriages that you've seen? What do they all have in common?
Man, that's a great question.
I love that question.
Well, I think first off, we all have blind spots that pride gets in the way, not just in marriage, but in all parts of life, where we don't see our flaws. Like in my own mind, like when I talk, my voice sounds like Eric Huffman's. It's this deep Morgan Freeman amazing podcast voice. And then when I really listen back to myself, it's more like Mickey Mouse than Eric Huffman.
I love your voice.
But I'm just saying, like, in deeper issues, we all have these blind spots where we don't often know how we're coming across to our spouse, where, we can be sharp with our words. We can be, sarcastic or mean when we're not meaning to be. But when we're humble enough to like really listen when our spouse says, hey, you might not have meant it, but this is how you're coming across. And pride kind of steps in and like, no, that's not how I am. But when we really listen and say, oh, wow, thank you for helping me see that blind spot.
Right.
I think that's huge. So staying humble. I think really working to be best friends with each other. That the healthiest couples are best friends. Like they prioritize their friendship with each other, and that's an aspect of the marriage that can grow richer with each season of life. Right. So keep pursuing each other, keep learning about each other.
I have to say, can you please share the story of Harold and Louise, because they might be one of our favorite. You were talking about people been married a long time. You have to share that story. It's the best.
Yeah, I would love it,
Yeah.
because I was going to ask a follow-up just about, it sounds good to stay friends and to pursue each other as best friends, but I think most people think of their best friends as someone they feel like being best friends with, and that's not always the case with your spouse. You don't feel like being best friends all the time. Maybe you don't naturally have everything in common or common interests, and so how do you pursue that even if you don't feel like it?
Well, I think feelings are kind of the god of this age that we live in, right? The world's like, follow your feelings. Your feelings are always right. Follow your heart, your feelings. And the thing is, like, our feelings are so fickle that if we're only following our feelings, we're going to do some messed up things. And ultimately, we're going to end up really unhappy because our feelings are sometimes a mirage. They're not a true compass that leads us always in the right direction.
Right.
And so, there are times you're going to not feel like being best friends with your spouse or pursuing your spouse or being kind to them, but it's so important. It's most important in those moments when you're not feeling it to pursue each other, because love really isn't a feeling. It's a commitment. It's an action. Mm-hmm. And when we remember that, then we can lead our feelings in the right direction, and our feelings usually catch up. And the couples we know who've really made it for 50, 60, 70 years and still like each other, not just love each other, but still like each other at the end of it, they've all pushed through a lot of seasons where they didn't feel like it, where they didn't like each other, but they said, in this season right now, we're butting heads, but I'm going to choose to love you. I'm going to choose to serve you. I'm going to choose to pursue you and to see the best in you and to speak kindly to you, even if my instinct would be to be sharp and cruel and critical of you. And the more we can do that, it's like making deposits in the little love bank of our marriage, where just like a 401k, you get to the end of your life and that marriage has had so many deposits in it that you are going to feel like being best friends. You've got so much history, so much shared respect and love. And and that's not just like pie in the sky, Hallmark movie channel kind of version of love. It really is just, it's like any part of life. There are days you don't feel like going to the gym, but a trainer will say like, well, if you want to be healthy, go the days you don't feel like it. There's going to be days you feel like just eating junk all day. I feel like eating junk all day every day.
I feel like doing it right now.
But those feelings, even though I do it sometimes, I know that those feelings ultimately aren't leading me in the right direction. And the more that I choose what's healthy over choose what feels right in the moment, in any part of life, your life's going to be better for it.
Yeah.
It definitely will be.
Yeah, I just, the part I think I'm hung up on, I think a lot of people are probably hung up on this, is we understand what it means to pursue our partner romantically, but what does it mean to pursue our partner as a friend? Like, how do you, in a marriage where you have all these other elements mixed in, how do you really prioritize the friendship? What's that look like practically?
I think you take a look at your calendar because, what we want to get done is usually on the calendar. That's what we're prioritizing.
Yeah.
And I think when it comes to spending time with our spouse, for some reason we get into this grind and this kind of autopilot dynamic where we're like expecting things to just be good, or if we just avoid the problems, they'll go away, or he or she knows that I love them. Like they just know. And I don't have to say it anymore. I don't have to
Right.
show it anymore. But really, the couples that have a thriving marriages and really are in it for the long haul, they prioritize date nights or day dates, whatever you want to call them. And I know
Yeah.
for some people, they get this more than others. But I mean, the only way you can have quality time is with quantity time. You have to put in the time. And the more time you spend together, some of it may be hard where you have these hard conversations or you have to work through stuff, but there's going to be some good time in there because you're growing and you're learning together. And so I think you have to put things on the calendar where you go spend time together on a regular basis. That's going to look different for everyone. I think especially for those who have kids and busy careers, have a time each year. Again, the frequency is going to look different, but get away together. For us and at EXO Marriage, we call it a vision retreat, where basically, and you can call it whatever you want,
Right.
but it's where you get time away, you pray together, you focus on God, you have a lot of fun together without distractions, and you also talk about what's going right and what's not going as well, and that you can improve on. And we have to be willing to have those open conversations in order to grow, because if we don't address an issue, we can't expect it to magically go away. Like we can get help with it. And I think sometimes, and I, in the early years, was very guilty of this. Like I went through a huge bout with anxiety and depression for years. And at first I just kind of thought it's just my problem. I need to handle it, or it's going to go away hopefully someday. But it's like, it was this huge wall between us because I didn't bring Dave into the picture.
Right.
And I very quickly found out, in marriage, it's never really his problem or her problem. It's always our problem. And we really have a responsibility as married people to bring our spouse into the picture. We shouldn't keep those things to ourselves. That's why we call our podcast The Naked Marriage. We're naked, meaning having no secrets. We're naked and unashamed, as it says in Genesis
Right.
2, like Adam and Eve. And we want to have that kind of closeness. But I think that we live in a culture that just looks down on vulnerability and on true intimacy. And we really kind of act like it's just sex, and sex is important, but your sex life is going to be so much better when you have a naked marriage and when you are honest, even with the problems, even with the yucky stuff. And I know in our own marriage, when we're able to be that honest with each other, our friendship grows, and out of that friendship, an appreciation grows, and more attraction grows,
Yeah.
and you have all those different levels of intimacy that we all really truly desire.
Yeah.
And for the friendship part specifically, I think it leads to an intentionality where you're just like, what are some ways that we can have more overlap instead of his
Yes,
hobbies, her
yes.
hobbies, his friends, her friends,
Yeah.
his dreams, her dreams. And so we've tried to just frame our whole life and goal and vision is like, how can we spend as much time together as possible? I mean, yes, still she's going to get with the girls and do her thing, and I'm going to go
Sure.
out with guys and do stuff. And I mean, we're not like Siamese twins or we're never apart, but we've tried to bring each other into one another's world as much as we can. Like for instance, there's a lot of shows and stuff I like that she doesn't, a lot of shows she likes that I don't.
Right.
But as much as we can, we'll sit down and be like, all right, what's something we can watch together? Or
Yeah.
she wasn't into sports at all because she grew up in this girl house where they just never watched it. And so, but she started watching some with me, and I would just explain the rules, and she would start, appreciating it. It's still not ever going to be her favorite, but
I
she'll
do appreciate
she'll
it a lot
appreciate
more.
it and enjoy it now, and we can watch it together. And I'll watch some of this stuff with her that I never would have watched, like Lifetime movies and stuff
I
that I
don't
would
watch Lifetime movies.
or
It's more like
wedding dress shows.
wedding.
There it is. Yeah.
And I'm like, all right, so I can tell you now, like what is in this season, with every.
You're pretty good at it.
I'm
You
pretty
are.
good.
You know.
I know how to say yes to the dress.
I know.
So we'll just try to bring each other into one another's world as much as we can.
Yeah.
And those shared moments are meaningful because, when we're just doing something we like alone, it's not even a fraction as meaningful it is if we're doing something and we can share the experience together. So friendship is really as simple as being intentional about trying to share moments together with someone.
Amen.
And that's how you build any friendship.
There's a certain kind of grace in that that you're describing in a couple, in a marriage, where it's not that you're faking interest. It's that, for example, my wife and I are in our 40s now, and we're kind of like you guys. We got married real young, been married a long time now. But there's this obligatory thing that happens to couples in Texas in their 40s where they have to suddenly get interested in antiquing. And I don't know why. It just happens. But I couldn't care less about antiques. I think it's just basically a glorified rummage sale. But my wife loves it all of a sudden. And so I've realized it's not up to me to figure out a way to love antiquing or to figure out what's interesting about antiquing. I just want to know what she finds interesting about it and sort of facilitate that and sort of play along with that because it makes me happy to make her happy. And she's the same way with the Astros. She couldn't care less about the Astros. She grew up in Ecuador. You know, baseball doesn't really exist down there. And yet when she asks me about what's happening in an Astros game, or she stays through the ninth inning with me now, it's like the most romantic thing she could ever do for me.
Yeah, it's like she is leaning in and
she's working at it.
Person.
I love it.
That's great.
The pitch clock has helped, I will say. The pitch clock in baseball.
Yeah, the pitch clock is moving things
helped
along
our marriage
Astros,
tremendously.
You're living in Houston at an exciting time.
That is an exciting
The
time.
Astros they're in dynasty mode, but
Yeah.
I think that when you'll share those moments with somebody, when she's with you at an Astros game, when you are with her at antiquing, then you're bonding in a way where that experience that they love is bringing out this side of them that you couldn't see any other place.
Yeah.
And so I want to know like every side of her, and and she wants to know every side of me. And so it's like when she's really enjoying something and doing something that I have no interest in, but because I'm so interested in her,
Right.
like you described, seeing her come to life when she's doing interior design or something that I have no skill in at all, but it helps me appreciate her even more and her unique giftedness and strengths. And it doesn't mean that like I'm going to love going to Hobby
go
Lobby
by yourself, right.
It's not me and the guys aren't going to go antiquing ever. But
I think
I totally
think
get it.
she doesn't want that either. I don't think she wants to come home and watch and find you watching Say Yes to the Dress alone.
Right.
You know?
I'd be
But-
like, what is going on?
But watching it together is good. I think that
Right,
makes sense.
right.
That's how we forge friendships, right? In marriage. That's so good. Now, there's been a running theme throughout your podcast, and again, it's called the Naked Marriage Podcast for anyone who's not familiar yet. Y'all started in 2018, about the same time we started the Maybe God podcast. And you started with an episode called Let's Talk About Sex. And that has been a theme that has, I would venture to guess that your most listened to or watched episodes have to do with sexual themes in marriage. Why did y'all sort of decide from the get-go, really, to talk about that topic in particular as it pertains to marriage?
Well, it's all she ever wants to talk about.
This is
First
not
of all.
I'm sure.
At
Yeah.
home,
Right.
over
Dave.
dinner.
I think you just wanted to provide a space where I would have to be forced to talk about it.
Right, yeah.
No, I mean,
My master plan works.
it's your plan. No, I think that we just, in our own experience, felt like there weren't that as Christian people. There's not a lot of places where people talk about this, in a
positive way.
positive
Right.
way, in a practical way, in a biblically based way. And so we were like, we want to enter into that, and hopefully maybe give others, license to do that as well, like in churches to do that more. And I know for me personally, I grew up in like the purity culture era, and I don't think it was completely all bad. I think the intention was good to help, people stay chaste and avoid some of these pitfalls with sexual promiscuity. But it really made the pendulum swing like completely in a direction where it made people scared to talk about sex or have these secrets. It was breeding ground for pornography. And, for a lot of ladies and of course the porn industry, I mean, it's no respecter of persons, men and women, can get caught up in that. But I know that for kind of the people growing up, in the time that I was growing up, it made us go to other places that are not of God to understand about sex. And it would give you these false narratives. And I brought a lot of those false narratives into our marriage. And then Dave, was dealing with the porn issue as well. And so we knew, we were like, listen, we want to help people, not only, hopefully people kind of younger, avoid some of the pitfalls, but also those who are dealing with the same things that we went through and even other issues. We want them to be able to talk about it, because I think part of the problem is that as married people, we don't even talk about these things. Like Dave always likes to say, just even the act of having a talk about sex seems more intimate than actually having sex for a lot of people. And it's like scary. And but if we don't talk about it, we can never really uncover what's really going on, why it doesn't seem to be what we each really are desiring, or maybe we're hurt, and so that's why we talk about it a lot, and it's become more comfortable to talk about as the years have gone on. But again, like I would have never thought this would be something that we talk about all the time, but we're happy to do so.
I mean, it's it's really just, it's finding a need. And I think it's what all of us in different ways are called to do, is just finding a real need and then doing your part to meet it. And we just saw, like Ashley was saying, there's just a real need. It's, especially among those who are trying to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
To have a safe place where you could ask real questions about sex, get real info about sex, get real healing about maybe baggage that you've got related to, sex in your past, whether that came from your own choices or past abuse, and in all these things, tragically, the church, for the most part, the church is getting better as a whole, but for the most part has been just silent.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just been silent. And that's made these people feel like they're suffering in isolation, or they're the only, the only one hurting.
Know.
So then that creates a dilemma within marriages where, sometimes, people with not knowing what to do with that, you'll just shut off kind of the sexual aspect of who they are, as if sex is somehow dirty in itself. And they forget, God made sex. It's a gift. It's a gift for married couples to enjoy together. And I think Christian married couples should be having the best sex on the planet, because that's how God designed it. And so but what we're seeing is largely the opposite. It's like, those, Christian folks that haven't had a safe place to have these conversations, are having all kinds of struggles and baggage and disconnect in their marriage and frustration with each other. And we just wanted to step into it and just be a safe place to have the conversations. Not again as people who have all the answers, but it's like, look, let's just talk about this. Let's bring on, people to share their experiences. Let's see what the Bible has to say. Let's dispel the myth that porn is like a good instructional video that is just going to spice things up. Because, I mean, even just a couple weeks ago on the podcast, the episode's not even out, we interviewed a guy named Joshua Broom, who is a pastor now, but who spent 6 years as an adult film star. And he before he found Christ, and he just talked about how, like, underneath the shiny veneer of that whole world, just the darkness and the dehumanization that it creates, both for the consumer and those producing it. And he said in the 10 years since he's left the industry, he's had 30 friends that have died by either suicide or drug overdose.
Goodness gracious.
And I know, and it's just terrible.
He said, it's this, on the outward veneer, people would think like, oh, that's the dream. That's what real sexual fulfillment looks like. And he said, and it's the emptiest, most dehumanizing form of sex. And now he's found Christ. And I mean, the guy just has this contagious joy. But we want to tell stories like that to say, listen, no matter what baggage you brought into the marriage, whether it was baggage from false messages related to shame, or whether it was baggage from, your own choices that you made, in Christ, guys, listen, we're a new creation. We can start again, and we can have a great sex life, and we need to prioritize it too. I mean, it's not just something we can have, but to really challenge folks and say, we've got to make the effort to keep connecting in this way through every season of life, because it's going to look different in every season. But it's important.
Good stuff. Thank you. I'll ask you a similar question I asked before about marriage generally, in terms of the sexual life of a married couple, like the strongest, healthiest sex life across marriages, right? What do you see as common themes there? Like, what do couples have in common when they're really clicking on all cylinders? Is there a frequency that works best for couples? Is there sort of a boundary or lack of boundary around fantasy and things like that? What are y'all seeing from the healthiest couples you talk to?
That's a great question. I would say frequency is one of the biggest questions we get. Like, what is that magic number? And I wish I could tell couples. Like, I wish I knew that.
I tell the couples exactly.
What is it?
I say, take the number you're thinking and double it.
Like, aim higher.
Spoken like a true man. Yeah.
I know, right?
But I mean, and every wife rolls her eyes when I say, not every wife. But
we hear from a lot of wives who have the higher libido and want more frequency. So, I mean, really, I think we try to dispel that myth as well. And so, it's a great exercise for couples to just talk about this and say, like, what we need to have a baseline for the frequency that we want to make sure we're having. Maybe for some it's every other day, or maybe it's every 3 days, or every day, or whatever it is,
or every
and then
week,
add to
or
it, or every week.
Say,
I mean, it's going to be different for everybody.
Like, at a minimum, we circle it down our calendar, and it's like, Mondays.
Here we go.
we're gonna start the week off
with a bang.
strong, with
So
a
to
bang,
speak.
right? Yeah,
Literally.
And if it happens, if
I
it
didn't
happens
mean to do that.
spontaneously throughout the week too, that's great.
Yeah,
but
Right.
leave room.
but we're gonna have anything in our life that is important, we tend to put on the calendar, and that seems unromantic for people or weird. But I'm like, why is that weird? It's like you're married to say, hey, Monday night's mommy and daddy time, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we're gonna
prioritize this.
But-
I think
Is it
why
that
it's
early?
weird is, again, it's the addiction to feelings. I think
Totally.
we're conditioned to think, well, you're supposed to be in the mood for it, you're supposed to feel it, and that can't
Yeah.
be planned, and so it's just mechanical or whatever.
I know, that is so true. We actually just had a dear friend of ours on the podcast, Shanti Feldhahn. You may be familiar with Shanti
Yeah.
and her books, and Dr. Seitzma, and they wrote a book on sex together, and it's really enlightening. But one thing she shared that just, I already knew this, but like it was cool to see the research behind it, is that for a lot of people, a lot of married couples, for the individuals like who may not be in the mood, it takes like making out and engaging in intimacy, and then those feelings kind of catch up.
Yeah.
And so there's just that's just supporting the science that go ahead and prioritize it, because more than likely you're actually going to end up enjoying
Yeah,
this. Like
right.
it's,
They had a word for it. I think it was like reactive arousal or something.
I think it was
where-
reactive arousal.
Where
Yeah.
for most or a big chunk
think
of
it was
people,
more than-
they're
yeah.
almost never just in the mood. Like it's
Right.
never just going to hit them like, oh my gosh, I'm in the mood. Now we've got to have this like steamy movie moment where we just
Right.
connect and it's fire. But that's not real life. Again, we're learning these false realities, and then we're basing our real life sex life on this false stuff we've seen. But real life, it's like you've got to be intentional. It's like, hey,
Right.
let's get together. Let's give each
Right.
other a back rub. Let's just start, maybe kissing and cuddling, and it leads to a place most of the time where there is arousal, there is desire, but
Right.
two couples that believe the myth that we both have to be equally aroused at just any random moment for sex to happen, that's like, catching a unicorn and getting struck by lightning at the same time. It's just not gonna
Right.
happen very often. So if you want a thriving sex life, it takes some intentionality, like thriving in any other part of life. That like, all right, well, that means we need to have time to connect.
Yeah.
Right.
It means most women need a lot of non-sexual physical affection from their husband through the day. It means that the words we speak to one another have to be, uplifting. It means that we need to have uninterrupted time where we can just kind of let down from the day. It means that we need to serve each other, kind of
Right.
maybe do chores the other would do to free up the mental space.
We call that chore play.
Shore play,
I like
right?
that. Is that trademarked by you
Oh
guys?
No, we
man,
stole it
I
from
think
somebody, yeah.
somebody else stole it, and they stole it from somebody else.
Yeah.
But I still love it. But you were asking, just to get back to your question on like for the couples that have the thriving sex life, have been together a long time. I think that the intentionality certainly, but also I think there's a friendship at the base of their relationship, and there's such a sense of humor because as our bodies are changing
Yeah.
and like. Testosterone goes low, or a woman has menopause, and all these things. I think that we have to give each other a lot of grace and and have a sense of humor in it. Like, oh, here it goes again, and then be willing to talk about it and to get help. The help that you need to
Right.
boost those hormones, or to get things that'll make it more pleasurable for you both, and more conducive to the environment that you need to create and things like that. And so, I think that sometimes though, if we in those early years when maybe everything is firing at all cylinders when it comes to our sex life, we just in our minds think it's always going to be this way. And so we always tell young couples, like, talk now about how you'd like it to look as you age, and just develop that friendship and that respect. I mean, you're going to, if you don't have a lot of love and a lot of respect and a whole lot of trust for each other, then your sex life is not going to be everything it could
Yeah.
be.
Right.
Because you do have to trust each other and of course have love and respect. And I think that, we talk to a lot of couples that have been married as long as we have or longer, and there's been some hurtful things said. There's been things not said, but there's been this like cold dynamic between them,
Yeah.
and it just feels like space. And that's not, and then you don't feel like being intimate because you feel like this person doesn't find me desirable. I don't think they really love me anymore. And that's where we see that breakdown.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're a maybe God listener and you're listening in right now or watching, you've always wanted us to sort of talk more in detail about some of these sexual issues, like really getting in the weeds. I'm just going to go ahead and say it now. We're going to outsource that to you guys and the Naked Marriage podcast, because you guys talk about everything. And there's really nothing off the table. And you've talked about everything from, I've heard you talk about everything from, pornography and its role in our sex lives, and dirty talk. You had an episode about dirty talk, I remember, what kind of Christian podcast has an episode about dirty talk? It's fascinating to me. And I really do admire your courage, because if we don't talk about it ourselves, we're going to be talking about it or hearing about it from the world, right? And surely we can have better conversations than the secular world does. And so I applaud that. Now, let's pivot a little bit. I mean, I love what you say about healthy couples and the need for frequency and greater frequency in healthy couples. I mean, I think the number that most studies point to is like 3 times a week, or you guys are like maybe 2. I've heard you say maybe 2, but you seem to default to like, whoever has the stronger sex drive in a healthy couple, like try to work toward that. And that's beautiful and good in a healthy relationship. And I hope my wife is listening. However, that not all relationships are healthy, right? And if someone has a sex addiction, for example, that rule might not apply, right? Because then it becomes sort of exploitative or abusive. And
different, very different issue.
Yes.
What kinds of issues do you see interrupting or really blocking a healthy sex life in marriages today?
Sure. It's a great question. I would put them in different categories, right? So some of the categories, one of the categories are the things that neither of you are at fault for it being there. So you could have an unhealthy season in your sex life just because one of you is unhealthy physically or mentally. Like we went through a time when, I have this thyroid condition. It threw my hormones all out of balance. My testosterone plummeted. My sex drive plummeted. And for the first time in my life, I had like real anxiety around sex. Because just to be very frank, like I was afraid, and I never thought that I would be dealing with this, especially at the time as a young man, where I was actually afraid that I might not be able to perform. Right. And that is a very vulnerable and terrifying place to be as a guy. And so I just, for a season, almost kind of shut the sexual part of my brain down. But at the same time, I knew that even through that difficult season, I had to prioritize it, and we had to figure it out. And Ashley was so tender during that time and patient, and we still connected intimately, but it was, it looked different, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it just did as I was trying to get my hormone levels right and all that. And thankfully now, like, I've got all the right medications. My testosterone's back where it needs to be. So sometimes when you go through a difficult season where things feel broken, it's not because of some like sin issue or some false mindset or porn or any of that. It's because one or both of you are really struggling with a mental health issue, with a physical health issue, a hormonal issue, and there's no shame in that. I think that you have to really lean on each other, serve each other through that. And we've had different seasons through, anxiety and depression that Ashley had, through that physical stuff I was going through, where you have to just be extra patient and tender with each other, but also proactively work to find solutions. Right. I think when we just say, well, this is just how I am now, and you're going to have to put sex out of your brain because it's not important for me anymore, so it can't be important for you, that's when it gets really unhealthy. And we do hear couples that are in that place, and it creates resentment, and it creates frustration that's completely unnecessary. So there's that category. Another category that is within our control is stuff like pornography, masturbation. I think masturbation, pornography, those two things, they tend to kind of go together. But even outside of pornography, there's sort of a masturbation epidemic right now, where what it is what's it doing? It's creating in our minds, it's training us to be very selfish lovers. It's training us to look at sex as a solo sport, so to speak. And it's under the guise of like, for women, there's a lot of products being marketed to them, vibrators and other things where it's like, hey, this is empowering. This is you taking control of your sexuality and pleasure. And it feels like very affirming and empowering of sex, but really it's the opposite. And for men as well, men in masturbation, when you're finally together in that moment of like wanting to serve each other as husband and wife and create mutual pleasure, both of you have trained your minds to just do what feels good for you and get to that point of climax as quickly as possible. And it's a cycle that a lot of folks are in. And again, it's one of those awkward things that isn't talked about, but I feel like God has
Yeah.
called us to the awkward. So,
Yeah.
so
Would
porn,
your,
masturbation.
is your advice to couples just to abstain from masturbation when you're married?
I mean, I'm not saying there is never. People say, is it a sin? Is it a sin if I like think about my wife and masturbate, or if I'm like, on a deployment and I'm overseas and I'm like, looking at pictures of my wife and masturbating because it's the only release I have. Is it a sin?
Right.
And I don't think that's really the right question. I'm not, like step in and referee, like, is that sin or not sin? But what I do firmly believe, as somebody who struggled for years with this issue, especially in tandem with pornography, and this even lasted beyond the pornography. Like even after I was finally able to break free from that, the addiction really that went with it, with masturbation, it lasted longer, and that took longer to break. But what I saw, like getting free from that, is like a freedom in my mind and a like a true connection with the two of us that was something so much better than where my mindset was back when I was caught up in it. And my unique experience isn't like that's also lining up with what we're seeing in like research and the experiences of a lot of other people. So
what do you mean there exactly? Like the idea that the affections for and the sparks that fly with your partner are greater when you abstain from masturbation?
Right. It's because
The
you're saving it for them.
yeah.
I mean, you're saving it for them. And like Dave said, the reason I think we don't come down like a super hard line on this is because there are some unique situations.
Of course.
Like deployment. You mentioned deployment or long periods apart, where maybe there is a place for that. And so it's just, and it's not. Some people argue that it's completely clear in the Bible that it's wrong based on one particular verse, but others have, there's other biblical basis for it not being entirely like a sin.
The Bible's basically quiet on this. I mean, the Bible talks a lot about lust.
Yeah.
But it's essentially silent on masturbation. I mean, there's one kind of obscure passage in the Old Testament where guy spilled a seed, and that wasn't
masturbation.
That wasn't masturbation.
Right. See,
that was a completely different
but
situation.
Some people will think that they're talking about masturbation.
That wasn't a masturbation
Sure.
passage at all.
Anybody that's curious, I think it's Genesis 38, right? Is Onan?
Look at you,
right?
man.
Because I love the story of Tamar. It's not really about Onan, but that's the story, right?
Right? Yeah.
You can look
and
that up.
The brother-in-law
and see.
that like was not called to like give her children after the death of his brother,
right?
And instead he just kind of used her,
exploited her
for sex,
right?
And was not interested in like bringing her into the family and giving her children, for his brother. So it was a really self act on his part that just objectified her and disrespected his dead brother, disrespected sex. I mean, but it all that to say, it wasn't about masturbation.
Yeah.
So I don't want to ever like try to speak some kind of rule where the Bible is silent.
Yeah.
But just practically. So again, I think, is it a sin is not really the best question.
Is this the best for my
really,
marriage?
is it the best for my sex life? And I would say that a person that works to abstain from masturbation is in the long run going to have a healthier sex life within marriage than a person who is habitually masturbating.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, and there's like both probably secular and Christian, research behind this and various books and stuff. So if people are like, not sure, I mean, look those things up, and we have a lot of episodes on that. To answer your question about kind of what are the categories, I want to add one other category to what kind of is a hindrance to having a thriving sex life. And that would be everybody, and we have to fight this too, just being too busy and wearing ourselves out.
Yeah, for
I
sure.
can't tell you how many messages we get from people that talk about like their husband or wife. It could be both. Like, she just says she's so tired, or he just says he's so tired. And like, so then they just don't have sex. I mean, like, literally, I mean, is that, and I know that sounds so simple, and I get it. Like, we've raised 4 kids, we have busy careers. Like, I get the exhaustion. I know sometimes too, I mean, there may be an illness involved. There may be caring for elderly parents, or they're a caretaker of maybe an ill child. I mean, there's all kinds of scenarios, and this isn't to make anybody feel bad,
No.
but I think we do need to recognize it for what it is, because what we don't even realize is that really for both of us, and to varying degrees, when when you're just not having sex, that really can add to the frustration between you. And
Yeah.
it's just this snowball effect of making your conversations more intense in a bad way. And just, and what we don't even realize is the power of sex to really bring us together. I mean, that's why God created sex, is to
Yeah.
bring a married couple together.
Yeah, it's a
Unlike
unifier.
any other thing. I mean, physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally. And so we don't want to cut ourselves off from that.
Well, and just to add to that, don't fall into the myth that like you can only have sex at the very end of the day after everything else is
True,
done.
yes,
Because that is when you're going to be most exhausted. And but a lot of couples, they're like, that's the only time we could do it. If there's any energy left after we've done everything else. And what you're really saying is everything else is more important. If there's anything left over, then I might throw the leftovers toward making love.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
instead to say like, what would it look like if we connected when our energy's at our best?
Right.
What would it look like if we, every now and then met at home on a lunch break
Right.
and,
Yeah.
and had a little afternoon delight? What would it look like if we,
Or
Yeah.
had sex before you go on the date.
yes,
Ooh.
there
You
you
know?
go.
Like,
Yeah.
So then it's not you're
Then you got
tired,
something to talk
and
about
having to put
after.
kids to bed.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a relaxed date right there.
That's fantastic. I just love how creative and open you guys are in these conversations. And Dave, one thing I wanted to have our listeners hear from you about specifically is men's struggles with porn. And, I think, Ashley, I want to talk to you about problems specific to women. But Dave, first and foremost, just talk a little bit about your past with pornography and how that developed, how that habit developed, and sort of what you ended up doing about it.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I was one of the 95% of American teenagers that is exposed to porn before the age of 18.
How old were you?
I was, let's see, I think the first time, and I was a little bit pre-internet at first.
Dial up,
so
baby.
44. I'll be 45 in October. And then my family was like late to the party on everything. I don't even think we got cable TV until I was in high school. So it was a little house on the prairie, basically. But I went to a friend's house, middle school, I think it was, and first saw like Playboy, kind of soft porn. And those images, of course, were like really, really enticing, and I was feeling all kinds of things. I knew it was wrong already as somebody raised in the church. Like, no, it's not good to lust and all that, but your eyes are drawn to it. So that was kind of the first thing. And then a few years later, I'd say probably early high school, I had a friend whose dad had like hardcore magazines. And like Penthouse, and he looked at that, and then all of a sudden I had these really explicit images in my mind, and from there it kind of put me on this quest of like trying to find images like that when I could. Now I didn't have a lot of access at first, but once I got into late high school and we had internet, I started looking up stuff, and
Right.
and then I'd feel bad and I'd stay away from it for a while, but then I would fall back into it. And I would never deal with it in a healthy way. I would do it. I would feel bad about it, and then I would
Delete your
not
search
do it.
history. Yeah, all that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then I'd fall back into it, and that cycle kind of continued on and off through college, and then Ashley and I got together late in college. I'd been free from it for a while because I was really like, no, I'm gonna get married, and I'm not gonna be tempted anymore, and so I didn't even tell her it had been a struggle, which was a cowardly mistake on my part. And we got married, and I would say probably 6 months into the marriage, these temptations came back out of just nowhere and really bombarded me. And I ended up, I don't know, maybe around the first year mark, falling back into it and just feeling ashamed, feeling like, oh my gosh, now I've committed adultery. Essentially, Jesus says to look with lust is to commit adultery in your heart.
Right.
I hated myself, but I didn't know how to break free from it. And I fell back kind of into it hard until Ashley ultimately found on our old clunky desktop computer where I'd been. And I was like so ashamed and so thrilled all at once. I mean, I was ashamed. I felt terrible that she'd found it, but I was thrilled that she'd found something that I had not had the courage to just confess on my own.
Wow.
And so
Yeah.
once it was out into the light, it helped us to start walking through it. And even the walking through it was a messy process because by that point it was so, it had become an addiction.
Right.
And I was I was living as an addict. And so even though I knew I wanted to be free, I knew I had to be free. I relapsed at least once. And that opens up wounds all over again. And, but ultimately we just kind of kept on that path. Ashley was amazing. Even though I had wounded her deeply, she was amazing at walking with me, making sure boundaries were in place, making sure accountability was in place. And so she showed so much grace by like not punishing me or not making me feel like, oh my gosh, you're disgusting. Or if you want those images and not me, then like I'm never going to be attracted to you again. Or just saying like, we're just not going to have sex for a year because,
like a punishment.
You're
Yeah.
gross and you're going to be punished and you're just going to detox from all that. She didn't do any of those things. I felt like her approach was where everything I was doing at the time mentally was just unhealthy and broken. The grace and the maturity that she showed through all of that was really a catalyst that kind of helped me get out of it once and for all. And I'm so thankful for that. She and Jesus are the heroes of that story.
Yeah.
And
Ashley,
then once you
go
get
ahead.
through it, then I think that once you get to a certain point, and I've never had a chemical addiction with alcohol or drugs, but from what I understand from talking to guys who have, sometimes the process is very similar as far as what's happening in your brain. It's difficult. It's really difficult in those early days, but then you get to a certain point where that temptation that just gripped you all the time, it's lost its grip on you. And then it's just doing the work of that all of us have to do is like just being wise and not like going looking for stuff that is not good, watching out for triggers that, and even now, like if we're watching a movie or something on Netflix or wherever, if a really steamy sex scene comes out of nowhere, I always try to like intentionally skip it or turn away.
Even if the kids aren't around, I do the same thing. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh,
Because
totally.
why?
It's, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, what good is that going to
But
do?
I think that's good advice, whether you've had a porn
Anyway,
issue or not.
yeah.
We don't like looking at those images it's just not healthy. It's not.
So Ashley, from your perspective, what was it like to find those images on your computer, and what gave you the strength to react in the gracious way that you did?
Oh man, when I found it, I wasn't looking for it. I just want to say that I was actually going on our computer because I was actually back in school in a master's program for teaching, and it was just where the internet was good in our old house. We lived in this 100-year-old home, and for some reason they hooked it up to where that's where the internet was great. It was before Wi-Fi.
Those were the days.
And so anyway, like the old days, I know. But I get on there and I just see the search history, and I'm in the descriptions. I was like, what in the world? And I could not believe. My first thought really was like, who broke into our house and went to our basement and looked at porn sites? Like, what creeper came in here? Like, that's really what I was thinking, because you hold your spouse on a pedestal.
Sure.
I was just like, what in the world? And I just feel like it was like, the Holy Spirit waking me up and saying, you've known something's been off between the two of you, and this is what's off, And so just for me too, it was like the worst day and the best day all at the same time, just like it was for Dave. And I remember I didn't really go deep and look at all of them. I didn't want to put that in my own mind. But I knew what was going on here, and I could see like the list that had been going on a long time.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh man. And so after I was disgusted, I was angry, I was sad, I was mad, I was just confused, and just all these feelings. And I prayed, and then I just was like, I have to hear Dave say this. Like, I have to address it with him, like from his own, like he has to tell me. So I called him at work, and he answered, and I called, like this was a normal, like we call each other a lot, even before cell phones. And so I called him, and he's just like, hey sweetie. And all I could muster up to say was like, do you have something you need to tell me? And he said he immediately knew I had found it. It was almost like he didn't empty his search history, because I think subconsciously you almost wanted me to find it, not to hurt me or anything, but just to get you out of this, Yeah. And we just he immediately just started apologizing, and he said he felt so terrible that I had to even find it, but also he was glad that it finally, I knew what was going on. And you ask, like, how did I have the grace, to give him? And that's just God, because there were definitely days where I'd be on my high horse thinking, holier than thou thoughts. Like I didn't, I had didn't do this to him. I've been a good wife. And it was like very quickly God would humble me and be like, okay, how many times today did you need my grace? And it's like hour by hour, right? Because I'm a broken human being too, a sinner saved by grace. And porn's not my issue, but I have plenty of other issues that God is constantly, helping me with. And so I think that helped me to stay humble. And I think that I just saw that when I, gave Dave like tools instead of judgment or ultimatums, it's like I saw him rise to the occasion. And there'd be a lot of days where he's like, I'm disgusting and I'm such a failure. And he would like have this, even if he didn't say it, I could see it on his face. And it was like, I just knew that I needed to speak life to him. I needed to speak God's truth to him, that he is not defined by his sin, that, he is more than a conqueror in Christ, and that God can renew his mind.
Yeah.
And that, he will get through this, that this is not who he is. This is something he did, but he can be free from this. And then on the other side of that is like a grit and a courage that you didn't even know you could have. And so it was a daily thing for us. I mean, it was really messy. I mean, it was not pretty. I will just say that. And I had plenty of tears. This was in conjunction. It wasn't because, like, my depression and anxiety were not because of this, but it happened in conjunction with it. And we were also in the midst of a horrible time with having in-law troubles. And we've written an entire book about this. It's coming out in September, called Married Into the Family. And it's not just our story, but many stories, and how to have peace with a multi-generational family relationships. But just to tell you, it was a really hard time.
It was a hard time.
But God, I mean, it's a miracle that he got us through. I mean, he got us through, and we were, we're stronger because of it.
How many years had y'all been married at that point?
Oh, we had just had our first child, so probably 4 years, 4.5.
Yeah. So I guess I had probably 2 years into the marriage. I fell back into it, and kind of like, and it had been like an on and off secret struggle for several years. Until she, she found it about year 4.
Okay.
And then we did and then over the next probably year, we really just kind of walked through that healing and the rebuilding trust process together.
Sure. Well, I have a similar story, Dave, just having been exposed to porn way too young, and it playing a part in my life for a long time, leading up to my marriage, and then in the first chapter of my marriage, which was probably more than 10 years of being married to my wife. I was watching porn periodically and not telling her, and then getting caught and all of that. It's really ugly, and I know how it affects people's intimacy and sex lives. And Ashley, one thing I've been really appreciative of in your approach to the work y'all are doing with your podcast is you talk to women about pornographic material that women are drawn to as well. It's not like just the guys are weirdos and hooked on porn. It's almost like we're more efficient than y'all are. We just get right to the chase, and women sort of, Twilight is pornography, but it just takes like 8 hours and 800 pages to get to the scene. But it's all the same, and it's just different.
But he's a vampire. It's different. He's a werewolf.
It's worse.
Wow.
Interspecies porn. Yeah. Anyway.
Right, interspecies.
Anyway, I don't. It's just like we're all a mess. I think that's the point. Yeah. And you've talked, Ashley, at times I believe, I don't want to speak out of turn, but you've talked about how you had an issue with just a fear of sex, and I wondered if you could speak to that from your angle.
Yeah, like sex, in my house growing up, I have wonderful parents who've been married 40 plus years, and I'm so grateful for them. And I grew up in an amazing church, but kind of within my home and even kind of in my little circle, Christian circles, sex was like the thing that when it was talked about, it was like, shut it down as fast as you can. It's the dirty little thing that married couples do it, but heaven forbid you even think about it. Like, I mean, and maybe, again, I got most gullible in my senior class. Maybe it's because I was taking things too literally and like too, I don't know. It became like the thing that, staying chaste, waiting before marriage almost became like an idol for me.
Yeah.
And I became so much more about what I didn't do than what I did as a Christian. And that was one of them. Like, I am the chaste girl, and almost wore it like a badge of honor. So then, fast forward, and this didn't mean like I wasn't saving like the kiss for the wedding day. Nothing wrong with that. But that wasn't our story. I mean, we were kissing and making out and all that kind of things. And we were not perfect either. But, I was determined to wait before marriage. And, by God's grace, we did. But I remember all of a sudden we're married and I'm supposed to flip this switch. And all of a sudden in my mind, I'm like, well, I'm supposed to be like a sexual goddess and just know what I'm doing. And it's supposed to be perfect. And so in those early years, clearly that's not the story. And it isn't for most people, even if they have had sex before, there's all this baggage that can come on. And I know for me, it was this fear, like there was something wrong with me. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
I just had this deep, and it wasn't that I wasn't enjoying it or things like that, but just not understand. It was like mentally and physically, there was this disconnect. And it took Dave showing a lot of patience and grace for me to just kind of, I don't know, just figure that out and marry the two and feel good about being a married woman, enjoying and engaging, in sex, because it just was a part of my brain and part of my personality that I had for so many years just literally just tried to shut off.
Yeah.
And I hear this, I'm not the only one, like so many women, especially like growing up in church where maybe it was talked about negative ways or in homes where it was talked about negative ways, they have very similar stories.
Sure. Yeah. And there's different reasons why people fear sex. And Dave talked about one of the reasons from a man's perspective with the hormonal changes and all of that during his health battle. And I know for women, sometimes the fear of sex can be physiological. And I don't know what the endometriosis or something where it's a painful experience.
Like vaginismus.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right. And it's just a very painful thing physically. And there are other reasons too. Sexual trauma in the past can affect someone's fear of sex. But you're saying you were afraid of sex from a performative standpoint, like you just didn't know if you were up to the task?
All of it. Just all of it. Like, I mean, it was just a lot of guilt too. I think that because I had shut it, like it was this dirty thing. Anytime, even if I had a question and I brought it up, to trusted people in my life, it was just shut down,
Interesting.
And so for me, I think there was shame just automatically right out of the gate attached to it when it's like, but it's like, no, you're married now. You should enjoy it. And it just took me a while to come to terms with that and to enjoy it. And I mean, I've even heard from women who had the same kind of mindset and then ended up having sex outside of marriage and then felt like once they got married that they would not allow themselves to enjoy sex because they made that one decision of having premarital sex, like that was God's punishment for them. And I'm like, that is just not at all found in the Bible. That's not how God works, that he wants us to be, we're new creations and he wants us to enjoy his gift of sex in marriage.
One of my favorite quotes about sex and Christianity or Christian culture is from Butch Hancock. And he said, life in Lubbock, Texas taught me that sex is the most awful, filthy thing on earth, and you should save it for someone you love.
Exactly. That is so true.
That's a great quote.
That's great.
Because of the mixed messages we get as Christian kids growing up. It's like, sex is awful. You should never do it until you're married. Do it with that person. And
you're right. That's
so
exactly.
What did you discover in the aftermath of getting married and sort of through the years about what the Bible says about enjoying sex? And what do you think the world and maybe the church needs to remember about what Scripture calls us to see regarding sex and marriage and sort of what God wants for us?
I love that question.
It's so good. Well, I mean, that's the heart of what we're doing. That's why our podcast is called the Naked Marriage Podcast. It's not just that, the word naked automatically draws us in, which is true.
Yeah.
But it's the picture of that very first couple, and it's an image of what God created marriage to be. It said Adam and Eve, the man and his wife, were naked and unashamed. Like that we can get back to that place where there's nakedness as a picture of not only physical intimacy, but emotional and spiritual intimacy. It's a picture of saying I have nothing to hide from you. Like there's nothing here that is hidden. And you see me, warts and scars and all, I see you the same, and yet we accept each other completely. We love and adore each other completely. And we can be in this intimate, beautiful union without shame and accept each other where we are. And that's how God loves us. And that's the deep form of intimacy that couples are meant to share, not just sexually, but sex is certainly one expression of that, a very important and special expression of that. And then when you look through Scripture, you look at Song of Solomon, which is just a celebration of sensuality within married sex. And, and I think to see that, to see that we can be creative, we can be innovative. We can be poetic. We can have fun. This is supposed to be fun.
Yeah.
If you're
Right.
not having fun in the marriage bed, then you're doing it wrong
Yeah.
because it's supposed to be fun. And that
And there's
doesn't
a freedom there.
and there's a freedom. Yeah. I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's the key word, I think, is giving people, married couples, that freedom to say, instead of just tiptoeing into the bedroom so scared, walking on eggshells of like all the things that maybe we're not supposed to do, to say, no, you're looking at it wrong. God's given you, as a married couple, an enormous amount of freedom
Right.
to explore each other and celebrate each other and bring pleasure to one another, and to do that naked and unashamed.
Yeah. So how do you know when, gosh, this is a hard question because I don't even know there's an answer. How do you know when someone in a marriage, when you are coming from like a pure desire for your spouse and you want to get creative with fantasy or, gadgets or whatever, and
Right.
and that's just out of a good place, versus bringing sort of the pornified culture into your marriage bed? Where's the line there? Is there anything you've been able to discern?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
We get a lot of questions from people about that because I do think, we're curious. We're like, okay, we have the freedom. We want to enjoy each other. We want to try different positions and maybe even some sexual toys. And I think that as long as you're not bringing, obviously another person into the marriage bed through, actually in person or through, through pornography, watching something, there is freedom there, but you both have to feel good about that. Like if you're going to bring a toy
you both have
in,
to feel safe.
you both have to feel safe and good about that. There should be no shame attached to it. If it's bringing you both pleasure, have at it. I mean, it's not, you're not bringing porn in there. It's not going, outside of the marriage
Right.
bed. I think that the same with positions. I think nobody should feel forced to do a certain position or to try, like we talk about all different kinds of things, like oral sex, like that should never be like, well, this is what Dave and Ashley said on their podcast that you should try this. That's not the approach. Like it needs to be something that you both really talk about in wanting to explore these things. But if one of you, for whatever reason, feels like a visceral response to it, and it could be because of past trauma, it could be because of who knows what, but your spouse is more important than that sexual act with your spouse.
Absolutely.
And so we have to be so loving and kind and full of grace and never feel pressured, but do it out of love and out of just wanting to explore each other.
And I would say a couple questions to maybe ask each other, not just in the moment, but when you should be able to talk about your sex life over breakfast, is if there's something you're wanting to try, to get to the heart of like, what about that feels really appealing to you? Why do you want to try
enticing?
that? And is it just some like porn fantasy that you're wanting to act out? Or is this like no, I feel like this would feel really good. And I mean, to get to the heart of it. And for the person that feels like, no, that this specific act or this specific thing or position or whatever, no, I don't want to do that. To talk about why, and to be able to talk about it kind of without shame or embarrassment of like, well, no, I don't. I just feel like that would be really uncomfortable. I feel like that would would feel degrading for me to do that. And to give each other a lot of grace to say like, I want you to feel so safe within the marriage bed that if that is making you feel threatened or uncomfortable or certainly in pain of any kind, then like let's take that off the table. But let's not get so just, I don't know, stiff in our mindset, rigid, that we think, okay, this is all we can do. Like we're just, we're gonna
just do missionary position.
Yeah, and that's it. And,
Right.
There's God gave you a lot more freedom than that.
Yeah, maybe the good line to think about if someone's looking for sort of something to hold on to here, and I always appreciate coming away with something like hard and fast to cling to, and I think about maybe if you can't talk about it at breakfast, maybe it's not something you should be introducing into your bed as a married couple. Like if you're too ashamed or if it's too just wrong to bring up in a one-on-one conversation, then maybe you're not ready for that, or maybe it's something you should leave in the past, or maybe it's something you're bringing into your life from some dark place, and or into your bed from some dark place, and maybe that's something you need freedom from. Or maybe you just need to bring it up at breakfast and see what happens. But
I think that's true.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. So great. Well, I really appreciate y'all's comments on that. Before we wrap up, and we're almost to our time here, one thing we're doing this summer at the Maybe God podcast is really trying to help single people, both just in their discipleship and the questions they're asking about faith, but also in their relationships and making meaningful connections with other single people in Houston area and all of that. And I wondered what you might have to say to single adults who are, getting married later than ever. And Christians are their churches are telling them to wait until they get married at 33 or whatever to engage in any kind of sex and things like that. What's your advice to people that are trying to stay faithful to what the Bible says or what God wants for them, while at the same time they're, single adults in the midst of what may be like their sexual peak, or they've got all these, natural desires and things? Do you have anything to say to single people in particular?
Yeah, you go ahead, sweetie. I feel like I just talked.
Yeah, that's great. First off, guys, thank you for listening. And I think there's so much good that can be done in the season of singleness, or even in a lifetime of singleness. I mean, so many of my heroes in the Bible were single for life. I think one of the mistakes the church has made is to look at singleness like a disease that has to be remedied through marriage, and to just push people into that as quickly as possible, instead of saying, like, no, embrace the beauty of the season that you're in, because in Christ you're already a whole person. We don't need that the spouse to complete us. Now, we can be one with our spouse in such a beautiful way, but that doesn't bring completion to our soul. Only Jesus can do that. And so never feel like you're less than, and never feel like you just got to rush through this season, and embrace the uniqueness of it, the freedom that comes from it, and live for Jesus wholeheartedly while you're there. A resource I'd love to recommend is our friends JJ and Kate Tomlin. They have a ministry called The Heart of Dating that is just gauged. It's not just for dating, it's really for singles. And they just got married. The two of them just got married, but Kate was leading a singles ministry long-term, well into her 30s, until they just were married about a year ago. And they still have such a heart for singles, and I love recommending them.
Is that like a podcast, or what is it?
They do have, it's a podcast. It's part of the Heart of Dating podcast.
It's excellent.
Is an excellent resource for singles. And then they do live events and a lot of stuff to really minister to folks in that demographic.
And they're very practical. I think that, because you were talking about, like, what are they supposed to do with this desire as a 30-something-year-old single person? And we get that question a lot, because we even on the Naked Marriage podcast have single people who have the desire to be married who are listening and have these questions. And I think
like,
that,
can I get a vibrator? Can I at least do this?
Oh, yeah. Like, what am I supposed to do with this? And I think that, the more that we feed that, the more that we're getting caught up in things like pornography or romance novels, erotica, masturbation, things like that. So we really need to watch that, and because it can become an addiction very easily. But I think that focusing on how we're growing in Christ, focusing on getting healthy and emotionally intelligent, and working through our own stuff, so that when and if God has someone for us to marry one day, it'll be great. But also just for our own relationship with the Lord, and our own health, as a person. And, I know it's a little complicated with when they are trying to wait until marriage. And I know too that, and I know Kate and JJ talk a lot about this in their podcast, but it's just one of those things where there can be a lot of shame attached to that as well. But again, God forgives, and we can, walk free from that shame, and try to do better. Like, if we have these things in our past. I mean, what else would you add to that, especially when it comes to, like, waiting, sweetie?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm so thankful for God's grace. I don't think that he ever calls us to walk in shame. That shame is something that's the devil's business. The Lord will bring conviction, which is different. I mean, that's when you're doing something that's unhealthy, that's hurting you, that's sinful. And it's like touching a hot stove, and the stove is hot. That's a natural survival instinct saying, get your hand off that. That's not good for you. And sex outside of marriage is like that. It shouldn't bring shame, but I do think that we should have that conviction of saying, okay, this isn't what God has for me. And so I want to step away from that, even if it's something I've done in the past. And instead, I want to, really do my best to live this part of my life where I don't have in marriage, I don't have that outlet for sex that God created. And so instead of going the culture's way of just leaning into some artificial outlets, which is really going to train me to be a bad spouse.
That's right.
Instead, like, I want to just wholeheartedly pour myself into finding fulfillment in other ways.
Yeah.
realizing that like, okay, those desires that God's given me for sex are natural. They're
Right,
good.
yeah.
They're good desires. There's nothing to be ashamed of. But in this season, without that healthy outlet for them, I'm going to kind of put those on the shelf, so to speak, even though that's difficult. I mean, that's a sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice well worth making. And I think that the more we're willing to make that, even if we haven't made that in the past, the more we're setting ourselves up for true fulfillment on a spiritual level in this season, and true fulfillment in a marriage down the road.
Amen. Well said. And finally, you guys are raising four boys, right? Ages 8 to 18. God bless you. I can only imagine the sex conversations you're having.
Oh gosh, yeah. It varies wildly.
I bet.
Yes.
I bet. I'd love for you to just share a word with parents that might be listening in right now about the need for these kinds of conversations about sex and sexuality with our children and teenagers as they're growing up.
Oh man, I think it's so important because we want to be those first people to talk about things like sex and our bodies and how God made us and why he created sex in a healthy way, in a biblically based way with our children. And just the hard truth is that kids are getting exposed to different narratives of sex, whether or not they're seeing pornography, but just even kids on a playground talking about a sexual act or whatever it is, they're getting exposed earlier than people think. And so it's not just waiting to have that big birds and bees talk like, you know, that people talk about, but it's really having lots of little kind of age appropriate talks.
Making it a normal part. Just conversation of like celebrating early on that God made you a girl or God made you a boy. And that's a beautiful thing. And just starting from the beginning and that right there is countercultural anymore in a world that says, just like, you know, one of your latest episodes, which was a great conversation. Can't remember the lady's name, about like gender and sexuality.
Oh, and Nancy Pearcey.
Yeah, she was excellent.
Awesome.
But just the sacredness that we should view the body, how God gave us the body, and that's a gift that he gave to us, and how we honor him with our bodies, how we live out our best life in the body he gave us. And I think you can start those conversations, you know, when they're, you know, 3, you know, talking about, man, God made you a girl, God made you a boy. That's amazing. That's wonderful. And then from there, in age appropriate ways, talk about bodies changing, talk about temptations and
protecting your body.
Protecting your body.
We talk a lot about that. I mean, you hear about people who've been through sexual abuse, you know, kind of, if only, like, and it's never the person's fault who goes through sexual abuse, but they just wish someone had been there to protect them. And so one way that we can try to help protect our kids from that is teaching them about their bodies. And I think, again, we need to do it earlier than we realize, and how, you know, you don't go touching someone else's private area. They should never touch your private area, or even show your privates to someone. Don't let them show their privates to you. This is for kids and adults, family, non-family. Like, we're that specific. And because we need to do that, like, we need to educate them, but also like Dave said, not it being a shame thing, but that's just being a wise kind of exercise. And then, you know, I know that Dave, and we have only boys, but and we both talk to them about, you know, sex and their bodies and things like that. But there does come a time kind of with our kids, and it comes around, like, what would you say, like with Chandler, was it around like 9, where you got real specific?
Yeah.
Like,
you're
age appropriately specific about what sex is.
Right.
Well, in an age appropriate way of, like, just making sure, you know, just kind of the biology of it. This is how God designed us, and this is this is where babies come from. You know, I actually wrote a whole book specifically for the teaching boys part, because that's the only experience I have, but it's called Raising Boys Who Respect Girls.
Yeah.
And it's really all about, like, these conversations, and, like, at what age, what the conversation should look like, kind of age by age.
Right.
And so that's a resource you could check out if you're interested. We also have some free resources on those same topics through exomarriage.com.
Exactly.
Awesome.
And like you were talking about the spectrum, you know, these days we have a kid going to college. You know, our 18-year-old's going to the University of Georgia in like a week or a week and a half.
I know, it's wild.
And so it's always, like, for us, we want to always be a safe place where our kids can ask us any question. And that still goes with our 18-year-old, just, you know, because, I mean, he's going to be in a world that's a totally different world than what he's experienced in high school. And, like, we've had, you know, some different conversations with him about just all these different things with sex and, like, what are you going to do in this scenario, that kind of thing. And also, like in the middle school years, don't be surprised if your kids come to you and they ask you like, they give you a word and you're like, I don't know this word. Don't be afraid to go look it up on the Urban Dictionary to find out what they're talking about. I've done this, and we try not to act shocked because we want to be able to talk to them about it. And, don't all of us want our kids to come to us instead of going and looking it up on the internet or going and asking a random kid.
Right.
So just being that safe place, that's kind of always been our goal.
Yeah, it sounds like you're really talking about just creating a culture of open conversation and communication in your home from the get-go, so you don't have to create a way to do it later, like just as early as possible, making those channels of communication open for your kids to basically talk about anything. And maybe this is something, Christians can learn from, everybody had that hippie friend growing up where like you go to their house and like nothing's off the table, and maybe not to that extreme, but man, we need to sort of
come to hippie house.
We're the hippie house.
It's like I had this friend, that his mom just never wore a bra, and
oh gosh,
and the dad was always smoking whatever he was smoking, and
right.
Maybe we don't need to take it to that extreme, but I think there is a lot of value in sort of moving on from the hyper vigilant, puritanical sort of culture where we keep all of our biggest questions in secret and keep it in the dark because we're ashamed of asking. And I really value that about y'all's podcast and about obviously the way you're raising your own family. And we're out of time now, but I'm just so grateful for y'all and sharing your witness with us today and with the world in all of the different ways you are. Sounds like you got a new book coming out. When's that coming out again?
Yes, it'll be in September, and it's our book about healthy in-law relationships called Married Into the Family, the Not So Secret Guide to Healthy In-Law Relationships.
Beautiful. And the website, once again, is?
Where do you want to send them?
Like you can find all of our marriage stuff where it's xomarriage.com. Letter X, letter O.
Awesome.
Marriage.com. And there's so many free resources there. We'd love to see you at one of our live events. In fact, this spring we'll even be in Houston.
All right.
So
we will, yeah.
Let's go.
So let's go.
Yeah.
So coming to your town.
Well, we'll include all of those links and information in the show notes. And if you're watching or listening right now and want to get more from Dave and Ashley, hope you'll check those links out. And always, you can find the podcasts wherever podcasts are found, and on YouTube and everywhere else if you like watching podcasts, by looking up the Naked Marriage Podcast. So Dave and Ashley Willis, thank you so much for spending this time with the Maybe God family, and hope to have you back again soon.
Thanks,
Thank you
Eric.
so much.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.